Welcome back. In part 2 of our first lecture series, we're going to start to define grammatical units. So one of our goals in this class is going to be to describe grammar or linguistic grammar as we see it used in student writing and other examples. So one of the things that we're going to need to do that is we're going to have to develop a linguistic grammar vocabulary. So how do we describe grammar? We're going to use some terms and learn some terms today. They're going to help us more objectively describe language usage. And while doing that, we're going to look at some of the different aspects that make up language from a linguistic perspective. So to begin building a linguistic vocabulary, we're going to need to know and understand these next four terms fairly well. Now we're going to get more specific with each one, but very generally, these are the largest units that make up language. This is language at a large scale. So starting from smallest to biggest, we're going to begin with a phoneme. So if you guys have had a linguistics class or a reading class, you've probably heard some of these terms before. Now, a phoneme is the smallest linguistic unit, if you will, and it is a unit of sound that you produce with your voice or with a written graph some way. These units of sound by themselves don't carry meaning, so it would be like the difference between saying buh or duh. I don't really know with any of those things unless you combine them with other phonemes to say something like dog, which would have D-O and J, duh, ah, and j at the end. So three different phonemes that we can combine into one singular morpheme, which is the smallest unit of meaning. So a morpheme is a number of phonemes strung together that in some way has some sort of meaning. We can say, okay, I understand what that word means, or if it's an inflectional morpheme like we talked about earlier, like ed, and that's on the back of a verb, we know that that means the past tense. So in some way, the smallest morphemes are the smallest units that have meaning. Now, syntax describes the arrangement of multiple morphemes. When I begin to build sentences and I say, the man went to the store, what I'm doing is I'm using English syntax to combine a variety of different morphemes in a way into a logical order that makes sense to you and that a listener can interpret and get information from. So that's what syntax is going to talk about. And then the last one, and one we'll probably use the least in this class, but is perhaps one of the most interesting, is semantics. And that's the construction of social meaning between two interlocutors, or two people who are speaking or writing. So that involves a lot of different things socially and how we as human beings take phonemes, morphemes, and syntax, use them all together to construct meaning that we can use socially. So let's go ahead and let's start to dive into some of these things individually. Let's go ahead and take a look at phonemes first. So phonemes are units of sound that can be strung together. They don't carry meaning alone. And these are things, this general study, the study of phonemes, is linked to phonetics, phonology. You might hear people talk about students in early grades learning phonics, which is similar, although it's not really the same thing. That typically describes a curriculum or something like that, and not really an objective science. And then the phonetic alphabet. So here we can look at all of the phonemes for the English language. And if we actually counted these, there's almost 40 of them. So there's a lot more phonemes than we actually have letters in the alphabet. And part of the reason that is because our vowel system in English is just so screwy. We can see here that, there's multiple ways for different E's and A's to work together. And so if your students have spelling issues, this is part of the reason why. It's because our writing system does not accurately represent our sound system in spoken English. So the way that people say things is going to be different than the way they write them. So try and keep that in mind as you're going. I'm not going to ask you to memorize this table, so don't freak out. I know it looks really confusing, but it is interesting to know that these things exist and to understand, that hey, this writing system is not the same as our sound system. So next, let's take a look at morphemes. Morphemes are the smallest units that carry meaning. So we can look at some examples. For the example I always like to use is cat. Cat in and of itself is a morpheme. We can see that there's three different phonemes here, k, a, and t, that are joined together to make one morpheme. So we can have morphemes that are entire words, and then we can also have morphemes that are inflectional. So that means that they are single or multiple phonemes that carry meaning, but they might not be able to stand alone. So if we add an S to cat and make it cats, we know that that S makes things plural. So that has meaning. That S for us has meaning when it is attached to the end of a singular noun. So that's what I mean when I say that they can be words or they can be inflections. So we could also do that with some verbs too. We have show. It's also a morpheme. It's also a series of phonemes strung together. But if we add showed plus ed, where we have another morpheme that cannot stand alone, but again carries meaning, says that we showed somebody something in the past tense. Now this graph over here is a little bit more complex than we're going to get in this class, but it also might be good to kind of just look this over and understand how the different types of morphemes are separated. So we have lexical morphemes, which are content words, nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, the things we use, either actions or things that we use to talk about our own lives. And these are going to make up almost 90% of our vocabulary, and in a lot of cases, probably a little bit more than 95%. And that's opposed to grammatical morphemes, things like the, and, that really are only there to demonstrate grammatical relationships. But we'll get into more of that a little bit later. So the next thing we're going to look at is syntax. So syntax describes the formation or structure of language, and it examines things like word order and how different grammatical units function in different contexts. So one of the things that we're going to talk about, sentence diagramming, is a really useful way to make syntactic relationships visible. Now this example over here is actually what's called a syntactic tree. It's not the same kind of sentence diagramming that we're going to do, but nevertheless it is very helpful for showing how these different pieces of language fit together to create an overall sentence. So here we can see that we have a sentence. It's broken into a noun phrase, that is the dog, and the verb phrase that consists of bit the man. And these are both things that we're going to talk about once we get to sentence diagramming in a little bit more detail, but just use that to have a good overview of syntax. Now the last thing that we're going to talk about, and again this is probably the most confusing but also in a lot of ways the most interesting, is semantics. So semantics studies how all of the other grammatical units, we've talked about phonemes, we've talked about morphemes, we've talked about syntax, how all of those other things come together in social contexts for us to create meaning as speakers or writers of this language. So there's a lot of variation, a lot of different ways that things can be interpreted based on how we say or write them. And we'll get into some examples of that here in just a second. So let's look at an example. So think about the following sentence, and I want you to visualize something that pops into your head. So our sentence is, Sherlock saw the man using binoculars. So take a second, process that, call up a visual image in your head. Okay, so how do we deal with ambiguity in language? If we look at this illustration over here and we think back to our sentence, there are two different ways that we can interpret that sentence. If we look at this first one, Sherlock saw the man using binoculars. So here we can see that Sherlock is the one using the binoculars. And in this other one, Sherlock saw the man using the binoculars. So here the man is using the binoculars. And so that's a particularly ambiguous sentence. And I'll kind of draw you guys out some diagrams so that we can understand what's going on here. So in our first example, we have over here Sherlock as the subject of our sentence. So the verb is saw. And then over here we have a direct object, which is the man. Now, using the binoculars is functioning adverbially here. It's telling us how he saw him. He saw him using the binoculars. And this isn't really how we would diagram a gerund like this, but it will suffice for these illustrative purposes. So again, this is describing the verb that Sherlock as the subject is performing, and telling us how he saw the man. Now, the other way that we could interpret this sentence is we still have Sherlock as the subject. He is still doing the seeing. Over here, the man is still the object. But instead of using binoculars functioning adverbially, describing how Sherlock saw him, it could be over here describing the man, answering the question, which man? The man using binoculars. So Sherlock saw the man who is using binoculars, as opposed to he himself saw the man using the binoculars that he had around his neck. So this is an example of how semantics would come into play when we're talking about language, especially when we start talking about ambiguous language. So if we think about this in a social context, and Sherlock or Dr. Watson walked up to us and said, Sherlock saw the man using binoculars. How are we to know whether or not it means this first one or this second one? Well, if we walked up and Sherlock had binoculars hanging around his neck, we can most likely assume that, yes, he used them adverbially to do the seeing. But again, it's just kind of one of those interesting things, and part of the reason why semantics is so interesting.